God is saying that there's a sowing and reaping relationship between eating the fruit and sowing the consequences. The serpent says, no, you can disobey the word of God and avoid the consequences. So Satan denies the relationship between sowing and reaping, and we see the consequences.
When you have a government that since the 1960s had taken upon itself the responsibility to solve social problems with the arm of the federal government, that somehow these things that used to be the responsibility of state governments, local governments, families, and the church suddenly now becomes the responsibility of the federal government to handle with additional bureaucracy and federal agencies. My guest this week is Jordan Bush, and he's a husband, father, author, and the head of content and education for Thank God for Bitcoin. Thank God for Bitcoin? Like, whoa, slow down there, right? Well, not so fast. Because once you hear Jordan speak and read his book, you'll see that maybe there's something to that idea. A way out of the slow societal slide downwards, an exit from inflation and all the evil that it funds, and a way to store your hard-earned wealth free from confiscation, slow or fast. Does that sound like something worth thanking God for? I think so, and Jordan does too. Which is why he also hosts the Thank God for Bitcoin conference where we met, and is authoring a children's book and much more. Because he wants the world, including families with kids of all ages, to know that there's an alternative to our broken money, a better and more sure foundation to build society upon, and a way to preserve our wealth for future generations. In the movie The Matrix, Morpheus offered Neo a choice between a red pill or a blue. Bitcoin has its own pill, and it's orange. So get your glass of water and your black trench coat, and let's go. Only, don't touch the mirror. In our conversation, Jordan and I discussed why our money is sick, church planting and hyperinflation, World War II, Bretton-Woods, and U.S. financial abuses, the dynamic of sowing and reaping, men as stewards, not gods, why we should thank God for Bitcoin, and finally, Bitcoin on offense versus defense. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. This show more than doubled in size in 2023, and we're looking forward to much more in 2024. You can help the channel grow by liking this video, subscribing, plus leaving a comment down below letting us know what you thought, and share this episode and another one of your favorites with a friend. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, the head of content and education for Thank God for Bitcoin, Jordan Bush. Hey, Jordan, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Hey, Will, good to be with you.
This has been a long time coming. We met back at your conference. What was it? Back in May, right? April, May of last year.
Yeah, May of this last year. Yep.
That was so crazy because I went to the Trad Dad conference in Battleground, Washington with C.R. Wiley, and that was where I found out that he was speaking at your conference. And I think I just bought a plane ticket and was out there like just a couple weeks later.
Yeah. We were super glad to have him there, and then again, surprised to have you there, and excited to have you there.
Yeah, it was a really good time. I'm really glad I came out. So, all right. So I want to put you on the spot a little bit, just out of the gate. Cool. All right, let's go. Okay. So Bitcoin is one of my favorite topics to cover, right? Okay. However, they are not my most popular episodes. Yeah. And so what that says to me is that there is some disconnect between my audience, which are very godly Christian men and women, and Bitcoin. Now, your conference is Thank God for Bitcoin. So I want to pitch you this fastball right down the middle to start with, and then we'll unpack it from there.
Hit me.
Why should we be thanking God for Bitcoin?
Yeah, I am, again, it's a great question. I also will say that so Thank God for Bitcoin, the business comes from, in the conference, come from the book. And when we were going through the process of writing and then naming the book, there was 8 of us who helped collaborate in the book, and there was probably 15 or 20 different names that we were kicking around. And when we first started listing them all, I heard Thank God for Bitcoin, and I thought to myself, and even said to my wife, well, at least we know the one that it won't be, which is like Thank God for Bitcoin. Because I was the only one working at that point in vocational ministry, super sensitive to the cringe and to anything that could, be seen as trivializing, the things of the Lord. I just was like the last anathema to me, the last thing I would ever want to do. And then just over time, the more that I thought about it, I was like, it actually is kind of catchy, and it, and it is true. Like, if if this is a good thing, James says that every good and perfect gift is from above and comes from God, and so like what else should we do with this thing other than thank God for it? So as far as the reason why I think Christians should thank God for Bitcoin, a lot of it comes down to the nature of what money is and the nature of what money, how it works, how it's worked historically, and the effects that it has on our lives, and understanding that the mechanisms of how money work reveal what we believe about God and about people and about a lot of other things. So I think that's a big part of it. Is once you understand how Bitcoin works and once you understand God's priorities, as crazy as it sounds, Bitcoin is actually better money than the money that we've gotten used to using, and so the yeah, just it's there's a lot to it. Again, this is a longer question that we can get more into, but like I think that's the biggest thing is God's been using the foolish things of the world to shame the wise for millennium, and so why would he do anything else? It's pretty funny to me. I laugh about it all the time that God would use something like magic internet money to shame all these other big national and international currencies. You have as they crumble progressively, Bitcoin has begun its ascent. So,
so let's yes, I agree, and let's drill into this because I think the journey of coming to understand Bitcoin, the one of the first big steps of it is not necessarily about Bitcoin at all.
Yeah.
It's about the money that we use currently, and that involves such a giant process of disillusionment. Like in a literal sense, there's disillusionment in the moral sense, which is like losing hope. Like I'm so disillusioned. But then there's like, I mean, literally like disillusion, stripping the illusions away of what the money that we currently use every day is. So let's, and then what I liked about what you did in the Thank God for Bitcoin book and what Jimmy Song did in his Fiat Ruins Everything book. He was a guest. Thank you for connecting with me with him, by the way. He was a guest a couple months ago. Is he making the moral case of not only is the money that we're currently using bad, it's actually immoral in a very powerful way. So maybe we'll start there and start building the case out from there.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great way to do it. And the reason for that would be like Jesus, one of the things that Jesus said was that those who are well have no need of a physician. It's those who are sick. And so in a lot of cases, the initial resistance that people have, one of the sources of initial resistance that people have to Bitcoin is they don't see the problem that Bitcoin was created to solve. They don't recognize it as that big of a deal, or they don't see it at all. And so it's been something that they're just like, why would I need to spend my time? And I honestly am very sympathetic, and that makes a lot of sense. And so again, a lot of what my job and my work consists of is helping just lay out the things that are wrong with the existing system and the way that it's negatively affecting people, and then the work of God's work all around the world, the people who are trying to do God's work around the world. Again, we'll go a little bit deeper in a little bit, but probably the easiest way to get into this is just kind of talk about my background and the way that I got involved in Bitcoin. So yes, I grew up in a Christian home. Went through, was in church all my life, ended up going to a Bible institute, and then continued on and finished, got my degree from a Bible college. I studied Bible philosophy and biblical languages, and I wanted to be a missionary. And so my wife and I got married, and over the course of a few years, we raised support, and then went to Montevideo, Uruguay, to be church planters there. So we get there, and we were thinking that, just what would that consist of? Well, we're going to go and we're going to preach the gospel to the people of Uruguay, specifically a neighborhood. And when I say neighborhood, think larger neighborhoods of 500,000 people thereabouts, called Pocitos, where there are very few churches. It's a very secular city, very secular place. This was the more upper middle class part of this city. And so we were going there to be a light in a very dark place, a place that has, where almost half the country identifies as atheist or agnostic. And so that's kind of what we anticipated life and ministry looking like. When we got there, within the first year that we were there, the church was planted, and about half of our church members were Venezuelan immigrants. And so as that happened, that we were not expecting that. And so as we started to get to know these people, we started to hear their stories and ask the question, why are you here? Why are there so many of you coming now? And what made you have to leave your home in Venezuela? And so they began to unpack, and we began to do work outside of that to try to understand this as well. They began to just talk about how the government of Venezuela hyperinflated their currency. That took the form of the government and different politicians made increasingly costly promises to the electorate to try to get elected. So if you elect me, I'll give you this free thing. If you elect me, I'll give you this free thing. And so over time, those promises increase. And the way that they then followed through on those promises was by printing more of the, Venezuelan Bolivar is the name of their currency. So they just continue to print. Yeah, exactly. This sounds like a great plan. This is easy. And so yeah, exactly. So they keep printing more and more money. They keep funding more and more of these welfare programs effectively, and giving out more and more money, especially to their friends, and giving sweetheart deals to their, people who are aligned with them and favorable to them, lending power to them. And so over the course of a number of years, you get to the point where the money literally became worthless. And so, to the point that people were throwing it in the street, using it to start fires. It just became worthless. And this took the form of, this isn't just limited to the extreme poor. We had people who were Venezuelan friends of ours who, were doctors, economists, different high level jobs, who at one point were making six figures in dollar terms every year. And then who over the course of a number of, 2 or 3, 4 years, they weren't even able to pay the rent. And so we just got to see, man, the ethics of money production. There are ethical concerns within this field of money production. It's not something that you're ever going to hear sermons about. It's not something that you're ever going to hear politicians talk about. It's because it's philosophical, and our level of political discourse in the United States and most other places is just not at that level. Mm-hmm. And so we just experienced, this is what's going on. So then me, the philosophy major, I kind of went down even deeper and was just trying to understand, well, is this a local to Venezuela thing primarily? Is there something unique that's, resulting or causing it to happen there? And the thing that I realized as I studied it was that almost every currency in Latin America and in South America has failed 3 to 4 times since a very important period. And that was in the year 1971 when the U.S. went off the gold standard.
Yep.
So seeing that had happened everywhere. This was what we were experiencing, seeing in Venezuela was just the latest. This is just the one that's happening today. This had happened numerous times, and so the consequences of that are huge for normal people. So imagine that Will, you want to start this podcast. You're living in South America. Let's just put it at, Venezuela. You're trying to start your podcast. You do all kinds of work to, create excess capital so that you can go buy a good microphone and all these different things. You deny yourself, you work, you save this money, and then you go out and, you're getting ready to buy all of these things that you're saving money for. And over the course of this time, the money's getting devalued. And so when you go to buy, let's say it takes you a year. Say it takes you a year to save up for a car, save up for your podcast equipment, whatever. And you then go to buy the podcast equipment. The dynamic that happens is that the money becomes significantly more worthless over time. And so the nominal cost of these things that you want to buy have actually increased. So they might have been $150 to start out with, and now they're $300. Or now they're $450. And so it just creates this dynamic where normal people who are working and saving are penalized. They just basically are stolen from. It's not just penalized, they're stolen from. Their purchasing power is stolen from them by virtue of the actions of the people who are rapidly devaluing the money supply by creating more of it. So that's kind of what I started to realize. This is a widespread problem, and it's happening in lots of places. And again, it's not just affecting these big government level problems. One of the things that we experienced in Uruguay was that there were very few churches there were very few full-time pastors. So that just means there's less and less time for the pastors who are there to be able to minister. And then there's very few churches that can afford church buildings because of this monetary devaluation dynamic. And so you have many churches that are perpetually weak and get weaker with every year that goes by because their money's getting more and more worthless. And so as I started to kind of see that dynamic, I just saw this is an existential threat for not just normal people, but also the ministry of the gospel in these places. There's less and less resources both in the form of money and time for both Christians who are living in these places to be able to minister. And also on top of that, it's also for the missions organizations that are sending out missionaries into these places, their budgets are affected as well. They constantly are needing to go out and raise more and more support to fund things like, the actual ministry they're doing, or to fund their health insurance, or to fund any number of things that are a part of sending missionaries. And so just over time in my own life and in the life of the people we're ministering to, we just saw, wow, this is a huge deal. This is it's having a devastating effect on both the people and the people in these places and the people trying to minister to them.
So I think listening to that, I hope people can hear some familiar themes based on where America is at right now. Yep. But then I hope that you can also hear, for those who are unconvinced of Bitcoin so far, where the moral case comes from. The idea being, and who was I talking to? One of my previous podcast guests, I don't know that it was Jimmy Song, I think it was someone else, was talking about how Latin America, I think it was Andrew Howard, actually. He was talking about how Latin America is such a ripe ground for Bitcoin in particular, because they've watched their currencies hyperinflate so many times. Yep. But you see the way that people's genuine godly desires to build prosperity for their family, to innovate, to create entrepreneurship, all these different things are undermined consistently by malfeasance with the money supply, which comes from what?
Yeah. So again, it comes from a view of money that basically treats money like it can be created out of thin air with basically no work necessary to produce it. And so and that's just a view of the world and the way that it works that's completely out of step with the way that God designed the world to work. And so this is what I would say. So what we just talked about was like, these are existential problems. Okay. Here's the problems that people on the ground are experiencing. That's nothing to say about Bitcoin. It's rolling it. And everybody sees these issues. Everybody, these things that we just outlined are a problem for everyone. Now, when you start, getting into, okay, well, what are some of the causes of this? You start getting into talking about things like fiat currency. Now, what is fiat currency? The word fiat just means it's basically the idea of like, let it be, like just creating it. It's like, it's basically saying this thing exists because it's like by dictate, I say this and so it is. And so throughout time, this has been something that's been tried numerous times. So it's basically fiat currency is currency that the actual money itself does not have value. It's actually, the value is tied to something else. So rather than, for instance, in England and Britain and different places, England and the United States and all these other places, for a long time, they used things like silver and gold as money. There were reasons for that. The primary reason, one of the biggest reasons, is because you want to have the things that we're eating and using every day. There is a production cost associated with those things. So as it relates to the cost, like where does the cost of food come from? It has to do with the cost needed to produce it and the labor, and that's involved and all these different things. So there are production costs to food, and there's production costs to computers and podcast equipment and cars and computer, just anything you can think of. There's production cost there. And so in the real world, money is no different. Money throughout history is another thing that needs to be produced. It's another thing that has a production cost. Okay. So when again, when we go to a time and place where gold was used as money, think about there's the production costs involved. Number one, you have to pay someone to go out and find the gold, or someone, or has to stumble upon it or something like that. So they have to find the gold. They then have to get it out of the ground. And the way that happens is by either paying people to do it or buying tools or some combination of the both of the two to get it up out of the ground, to refine it, which takes time and a whole, bunch of energy and effort to refine it, then to turn it into a certain type of coin or certain size, and then stamp it with a generally the image of a certain sovereign or ruler or something. And so all of that process has a cost associated with it. And so what that cost serves to be is it serves to be basically a barrier, or it serves to be something that it's a limiting factor to the amount of money that can be created. So in the case of gold, you're limited by the amount of money that you have to pay to do the process of creating the money. You're also limited by the amount of gold that you have access to. So what this does is the scarcity of the thing that's used as money helps to be part of the value proposition. All right. Because again, if I have a scarce amount of food, I don't want to just give it away. Like, the question is, why don't we use something like sand as money? Because if we use sand as money, we have the person who's producing the scarce quantity of, let's say, food. They're producing a scarce amount of food. And then if you can just go out to the beach and scoop up, or to the ground and scoop up, 100 million grains of sand, and then just go, hey man, here, I've got this sand to give you. You're trading a non-scarce thing for something that is scarce. And it doesn't make sense for the person exchanging the scarce thing to exchange it for something that can just be easily retrieved for far less effort, far less cost than it costs them to produce the scarce good. So does that make sense? Like that's kind of what that dynamic that we all recognize in every other part of the world actually does apply to money as well. But most of us are so accustomed to the world that we live in, where money is paper, and really the value is added by the fact that the entity issuing the paper has lots of guns and nuclear weapons and and power and all these kind of things. We're used to that being the source of value. And in reality, while that is part of it, and it has always been part of it, it's not a part of what has served as money. It's not the only thing, and it's not the biggest aspect of it either.
So what used to be true about money, just to take this next step and put these pieces together, is that money used to have a cost to produce it. If gold is your money, it costs money to produce the gold, to mine it out, right? Okay.
Correct.
Now with fiat currency, it costs nothing to produce the currency. That's the so-called money printer. That they turn the money printer on, and we just printed, I don't know, how much money are they printing they stopped sending money to Ukraine. I forgot how much money, but how much did they print to send to Ukraine? How much did they print, during COVID? Money could just literally come out of nowhere, whereas every other kind of money prior to fiat currency, this money out of nowhere, used to have a cost to produce. So it was naturally scarce, right? And the scarcity used to be baked into money. Okay, so now we've transitioned in 1971 to a non-scarce form of money called fiat currency, which can be produced out of nothing, right?
Yeah.
So plug that now into the situation that you saw in Uruguay, vis-a-vis what happened in Venezuela, right? Yes. How do these things connect?
Perfect. So, great question. So basically, in order to do that, we have to take another couple steps back. So in the big place where this change, the seeds of this change were sown near the end of World War II. So again,
let's go.
Yes, exactly. So as you're leading into this, so up to World War II, you have gold and silver are serving as money. This is, again, so you had scarce money. It was good. Now, throughout World War II, you had the countries of Europe are just fighting for survival. They're trying to survive, the Nazi invasion and all these kind of things. And they're spending, every resource they can, basically, a ton of their resources in order to buy bullets and, guns and food in order to just survive. And so as World War II was drawing to a close, there was a meeting and by the time it looked like the Allies were going to win, and basically all these nations started to realize, okay, well, most of the countries in Europe have spent the vast majority of their gold and paid the vast majority of their gold and their other scarce monies that they're using. They've paid it to countries like the United States, who had the benefit of their geographical isolation. Like they paid and bought weapons and food and all kinds of stuff from the United States. So now we're looking at what is the post-World War II, the post-war money situation going to look like? What are we going to use as money? And so in this situation, the United States obviously has a tremendous amount of leverage. So they're holding all of this gold, or a huge percentage of Europe's gold now, and so they're not just gonna just be like, "Hey guys, here, let's just give it back to you now that the war's over." No, these were real economic transactions that took place, and so the question was for everybody was, what are we going to do now? And so they kicked around a few different ideas. One of them. There's a few different ideas that got kicked around. The one that ended up getting chosen was the one that was suggested by the United States, because again, they're holding the lion's share of the quote unquote real money. Yeah. And so they're basically their idea was to do the following. So what they said is, okay, here's what we're going to do. We have the vast majority of the gold. What we're going to do is we're going to peg the US dollar to a certain amount of gold. So we're going to, for instance, I can't remember the numbers offhand. I want to say it was like one ounce of gold would be like $20, something along these lines. And so then what they said is, here's what we'll do. We'll keep the gold here in the United States, and then we'll give these nations around the world, we'll give them US dollars, US dollar reserves. So you guys we're going to hold the gold. You guys are going to hold US dollars. And then at some point, if you guys want to exchange dollars for gold, then we can do that. We can do like an exchange. So it was a full reserve, or not full reserve, a partial reserve system, where again it would allow these countries to start over. It would also allow them to have the benefit. One of the downsides of gold and why gold has stopped being used broadly is, and one of the inconveniences of it is that it's heavy. It's not convenient. There's a number of reasons, but one of them is that it's heavy. Nobody wants to lug around, a bunch of gold. It's risky. Someone could rob you. You could lose it. It's got some things that make it less than ideal. Another thing is that, so in that case, something like fiat currency, paper currency is much more desirable because it's lighter. Again, there's a number of other reasons as well, but they basically, the United States said, "Hey, let's do this. Let's operate. You guys can hold dollars. We will not go printer crazy. We will maintain a ratio of gold to dollars of 1-20, or I believe that's it, but it's whatever it is. We had a fixed ratio, and so the idea was to try to give these countries the benefit of having gold, despite the fact that they of a scarce currency, despite the fact that they didn't have access to a scarce currency. So again, all things being equal, this seems like a good plan, good enough for everyone to agree to. So
it's like America has all the gold and is giving these other countries a debt note in exchange for gold. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's basically them. The United States is leveraging their power. They have the benefit of having all this gold, and so they just basically said, "Hey, this is what we would like to do." And again, there wasn't another option that seemed that really was going to work for everybody, and that was going to answer the 900-pound United States gorilla in the room.
You can just give them the gold back.
Yeah, exactly. But they're not going to do that. No one's just going to give away gold that was given in exchange for literally, what is the value of saving your life? That's what really the United States was saying, is how worth is it to you for us to save your life? And so then, they ended up doing it. Mm-hmm. So from 1944 to 1971, you had this system where the United States held the gold, these other countries held dollar reserves, and then they just created their own currencies that were backed by US dollars. So again, that all things being equal, that was a good system. The problem that was revealed in 1971 was, I can't remember, I believe it's France. It's either France or Germany. One of them went to the United States, and they said, "You know what? It's been a while since we exchanged dollars for gold. The dollars are very convenient, so we want to exchange. We just want to exchange some of our dollars for gold." The next day, President Nixon came out and said that the United States was stopping the convertibility of gold for U.S. dollars.
The next day.
The next day, yeah. Because again, and basically what this revealed was that the United States had been abusing its exorbitant privilege, is what it was called. They'd actually been printing far more dollars than they had promised to. And so they basically had betrayed their trust that all these other nations had put in them. And they had done that for a number of different reasons. Number one, the Cold War. Like again, this doesn't justify it, but in their mind, like it allowed them, abusing their power allowed them to continue to exercise, power and control and influence on the global stage in the face of Russia and its ascent to try to become the next global superpower. So you had the United States do this. Now, again, think about this.
I have so many questions, by the way, but continue.
Good. Yeah. And we can get to them. So, but imagine this, like, so you can think about, like, so the United States is like a tent peg or like a stake that's driven into the ground. Okay. It's the ground. Then so United States, the gold is the ground. You have a line that is the US dollar. And then you have these individual national currencies are like a kite. Okay. And so they're up there flighting. They're tethered to the ground. They're tethered to reality. They're tethered to a scarce resource. And when the United States cut that line that was connecting these fiat currencies to gold, basically what happened is all these other currencies, national currencies, became free floating. They're just sitting there floating. There's nothing tethering them to reality, tethering them to a scarce resource. And so then all these currencies are basically only as scarce as their governments are fiscally responsible. So does that make sense? So they're only going to be as scarce now as the governments are fiscally responsible, as they're willing to not print more of their own currency. And so if there's anything that we've learned over the period of time, it's that, human governments, they generally over time they want to do the thing that's the easiest and the thing that's going to, especially in a democracy, they're going to do the thing that's easiest and things that give them power. They're going to promise whatever they can to get more power. And so over time, what we now see in Venezuela and in places like Argentina and all these kind of things began to happen with much greater effect. It really just happened. This situation befell all these countries at the same time.
Okay, so I have so many questions about all that for so many different reasons. Now, what you're talking about is the Bretton-Woods Agreement, right? That's correct. Okay. Correct. So this is really interesting, because I actually tweeted about this recently about the WTF happened in 1971.com site where you can start to see all this stuff kind of start to go wrong when Nixon, no way, removed the convertibility of gold. But where I want to start actually with a question, did he do this unilaterally? Was it like France and Germany showed up and like, we want our gold back? And he's like, and just wrote off the executive order and then like threw it out there? Or like, how did that actually go down? And then I'll want to start working backwards from there, because it seems to me that this post-war period from like 1945 to like 1970 lives in the in the American imagination, certainly until 1945 to 1960.
Yes,
lives in the American imagination as this idyllic time in all of human history that shall not be questioned. And for a lot of people, the 60s are that too. So we'll just broadly say this 25-year period. But the more you actually start peeling back the layers and looking into that, more and more stuff starts coming out that's quite scary to look at. So, but let's start with how the actual Bretton-Woods Agreement was revoked, and then we'll work backwards from there to the abuses that came about from the United States having all that power.
Yeah. And so basically, it's been like just long enough where I'm like trying to remember the details of this. But basically, of course, no, it wasn't just Nixon unilateral. like they have all these members of his staff who are basically like, if you don't do this, then there's going to be a crisis. There could potentially be a crisis. And the crisis would take this form of, again, if it's not a big deal if one country does this.
Right.
But if other countries start doing this, and if the United States says no, if they basically just say no to them without just cutting the actual system, just saying we're not doing this anymore, like it basically forces all kinds of other uncomfortable questions to be asked. So by just saying we're stopping doing this program, like it's over, and now like you have to deal with it. And so like So it's really, I mean, it's horribly immoral, but like,
Yeah.
and so this is what I'm saying is it's, I mean, it's a betrayal, honestly. Like America, we as growing up in America, we're like, oh, we're these great moral actors on an otherwise in an otherwise morally bankrupt world, and this, the reality of what happened, just kind of shatters that to pieces. Which is, again, as Christians, we shouldn't have an issue with. Like, again, doesn't matter what nationality you have, you have a sin problem, and and the governments of the world have these same issues. They govern for their own glory and try to seek out, their own. Seek out their own glory and fame in as easy a way as possible, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So as to the actual mechanics, it's been a while since I've looked into this, so I don't know exactly all the details of it. But this is something that, again, this is what motivated it. It said, hey, we understand this is going to have negative consequences for us, and so we're just going to just cut the plug. We're just going to just cut the cord completely, and then, rather than like all these other countries are going to have to spend this time trying to figure out what they do. They're going to have all these things at home that are going on, and whatever, like, obviously there's going to be repercussions with us, but again, on a number of levels, what are they really going to do to the United States? Like the United States,
I was going to ask that question.
Yeah. At this point, the United States is this nuclear superpower. And so they have a tremendous political and military might that, I mean, it wasn't like France was going to be like, oh, this betrayal is such that we're going to go to war against the United States. Like, again, that just wasn't going to happen.
We just stole all their gold, though. Like, that's literally what just happened, right?
Yeah. Well, so they didn't steal their gold because they had paid their gold fair and share to the United States for bullets and food and all this kind of stuff. Okay. So it just ended up, again, it would be like the same dynamic of, like, I'm just trying to imagine, like, what's something, like, what's a resource that one country has that everybody else can. So Uruguay, we could say this, for instance, like, let's say something happened and to all of the beef supply in the United States, they all just died for some reason. There's some sort of cataclysmic, flu that fell over them and they all died. Well, then what would happen is there'd become this giant premium on beef. And so countries like Uruguay, which at this point are it's a tiny little country. Nobody even knows where it is. Basically, the one thing that they have a lot of is beef. They have tons of cows. There's like 3 or 4 cows for every person in Uruguay. And so all of a sudden, the value of those cows would go up tremendously. And so this is a similar dynamic. So you would now all of a sudden everybody would be clamoring to try to get this resource that is now scarce or whatever. And so again, there's no quick, easy way to get gold. It's not a perfect analogy, but there's no quick, easy way to get gold. The United States has the lion's share of the gold. And so they have the leverage to make the decisions that they did. So They didn't steal, but they did betray. They did betray what they said. And so the US dollar reserves that all these countries were holding were actually, the purchasing power of them was actually far less than than the face value was supposed to be per the agreement, if that makes sense.
Okay. So they did steal in a sense, but not in the sense that I meant. Like you paid the gold fair and square. We gave you this debt note, right? Yes. But then behind the scenes, we're doing shenanigans. And then we got called out. And then we're like, game's over. Bye. Like, deal with it.
Yes. So effectively, France and all these other countries, Germany, the post-World War II people, I guess Germany, but like England, some of these other countries, like, they're operating in a world where they're thinking that the price of a dollar, or the purchasing power of a dollar, is that it can buy 20 or 30, 1 ounce of gold can buy $20 or $30, and vice versa.
Right.
In reality, the exchange was far different than that. Because the United States throughout that period had been printing more dollars than they had said that they were going to. Right. And so the purchasing power of those dollars was actually far less than it was in reality, or than the stated value was.
Okay. I did a tweet or maybe it was last week, where I pointed out that no fault divorce was 1969. That was the first, right? 1971 was the end of Bretton-Woods, the convertibility of gold. Roe v. Wade was 1972.
Yeah.
And the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, what was that, 67? Something like that, 68.
That one I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah. So like, there was a lot of really bad stuff going on in the late 60s, early 70s, that is just like pay no to how do we get here as a nation? I don't know. Let's go look back to that particular time when we started legalizing things like the end of marriage without cause and the ability to kill your unborn child, and then
100%.
also the severing of the money supply from anything scarce or of real value. When America started making, and that it was all done behind the scenes too. Like I didn't understand that component of it, that America had been, go figure, that America essentially under Lyndon Johnson and then Nixon had been doing shenanigans with the money supply to fight the Cold War, right? And that's a whole thing. And Vietnam as well, right? Had been doing shenanigans with the money supply, and then France and Germany or someone shows up and calls us out on it. And instead of like taking responsibility, we're like, no, deal's off. We're America, deal with it. Like that is such an America thing to do, and not in a good way.
Yeah, no, 100%. And so again, you keep going back further, and what this question of what is money is, like, it is the defining, in many ways, it is one of the biggest two defining questions that affects everything else in society. And this is why I say that. So one of the things that happened is, and one of the reasons why, I mean, a nation's money is in many senses, like in many ways, it's the lifeblood of a country. So it's the thing that you use to denominate all of the things without which you die. So where money is used, so it's what I use to buy food. It's what I use to buy cars. It's what I use to pay for my health care. And so it's this incredibly influential thing. And so when this thing by which you denominate everything else is messed with, of course you're going to have consequences. There's going to be all kinds of other things that are affected. So for instance, you could talk about once the United States began making money and separated it from a scarce resource like gold, one of the things that allowed them to do was to then fund whatever they want. So again, if you can, again, God created the world, and we could get into this too. God created the world in such a way as he created to accord with and to align with his priorities. He has things that he wants to happen. And so he created the world to work that way. And so one of the principles, if you wanted to summarize, this is front to back of the Bible, you're trying to summarize, what are some of the foundational things that God has made to govern the way that the universe works? You could talk about the principle of sowing and reaping. And so this principle, the realization of this was, I was a pastor in Uruguay. I was doing sermon prep. I was in the book of Galatians, and near the end, the Apostle Paul says that God is not mocked, for what a man sows, that will he also reap. So I was like trying to re-put this in my own words. It's like, okay, so God has so hardwired this principle of sowing and reaping into the fabric of the world that to deny it is tantamount to mocking God. And so I just started to think, okay, like, what are some examples of this? Well, the Apostle Paul says that if you don't work, to the Thessalonians, if you don't work, then neither shall you eat. So Paul says there ought to be a sowing and reaping relationship between working and eating. And so he says, if you're willing to work, then you'll eat. If you're not willing to work, you will not eat. And if you do that for long enough, what's the result? You die. If you don't eat, then you die. If you're not willing to work, Paul says, you should die. And so there's this fixed sowing and reaping relationship. You keep going on to this. You look at things like, you could go through a ton of things, but one of the things is, one of the things that separates the religion of Islam from Christianity. Within Islam, Allah can just forgive sins. He can just basically say, like, unilaterally, I forgive sins. This is why Muslims don't understand why Jesus had to die. They're like, what? That's not necessary in their framework. To Christians, it is. And the reason for that is because, like, there is a real debt that requires real payment.
Yeah, and so real justice.
Yes, this is what real justice looks like. You can't just papally announce that justice is whatever you want it to be. There actually has to be a penalty for this. And so the more that I was thinking about this, I was thinking about just thinking about this fact, like, God created the world to operate according to sowing and reaping, and to deny that is to mock God, not a good thing. And so then I started thinking about in the book of Romans 1, the Apostle Paul is describing what the nature of sin is. And he says, and I can't remember the exact verse, Romans 1:21 maybe, they refuse to acknowledge God as God or be grateful. And so what is being described there? They refuse to acknowledge that God is the source of their life. He's the source of everything that they have, and they refuse to be grateful for it. So they refuse to acknowledge that there's a relationship between sowing and reaping, between their life itself. And so, like, this is the nature of sin. It's saying that I can act in such a way and there not be consequences. Mm-hmm. I can avoid the consequences through my own ingenuity, through doing whatever I want to. And so the first place you see this in the scriptures is from the mouth of the serpent. He begins to ask Adam and Eve different questions. And he said, did God say that you can't eat of any of the trees in the garden? And Eve goes, no. He said that we can't eat from this certain tree. And if we do, or even touch it, we'll die. Mm-hmm. And that, and right in that moment, the serpent says, you will not die. And so in that moment, we're like Adam and Eve, with humanity, was faced with a decision. Is God's word correct? God says, if we eat of the fruit of this tree, we will die. Or is the serpent correct, that if we eat the fruit of the tree, we will not die? Someone is describing reality correctly. The other person is not. It's a binary choice. And so who is going to be right? God is saying that there's a sowing and reaping relationship between eating the fruit and sowing the consequences. The serpent says, no, you can disobey the word of God and avoid the consequences. So Satan denies the relationship between sowing and reaping, and we see the consequences. God obviously was telling the truth. And so ever since then, the sin has entered into the world. And if people are not willing to acknowledge this relationship between revelation and objective truth and reality, they bear all kinds of consequences on all kinds of levels. You could do this in terms of immorality within relationships. So relationships break down. Where that trust is lost, then things start to break down, and there's all kinds of horribly destructive consequences of it.
Sir, I must say that I'm shocked that you are suggesting that America at the end of the 1960s would have made decisions that were irrespective. They made these decisions irrespective of the consequences, that they did not think through the consequences of their actions. I'm shocked that you would suggest that America would behave in such a way at the end of the 1960s. How dare you?
Radical idea, I know. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's actually the thrust of the entire decade, wasn't it? Like, yeah. Hey, you don't like the fact that you married someone who isn't making you quote unquote fulfilled. Well, just end the divorce. No fault.
Yes. Just
tidy. Oh, you don't like the fact that you had sex and now a child has resulted from that. Oh, just kill the child. Oh, we did this deal with this arrangement with these countries that we had saved, from the Nazi threat during World War II. And then we went and we had all this malfeasance behind the scenes. Oh, well, we'll just end the deal. No problem. What could possibly go wrong, right? Exactly. And then what happened in 1970? What happened in 1971 shows what goes wrong. And the thing is, just to reinforce your point, is that it's not like these things couldn't have been foreseen. Is with the dynamic of sowing and reaping. Yeah. If you do a thing, this thing results from it. If you act immorally, prepare for consequences of your sin, material, real world consequences, independent of the eternal penalty. Consequences and penalty are not the same thing, right? But they're very linked, in some important ways. And in the same way, when you detach the money supply that people are spending from anything with real world value, and you throw away the thing with the real world value, so you have this money supply that's just floating on air, and the only thing keeping it tethered to the ground is the responsibility of politicians and bureaucrats. Yeah. It's a heck of a gamble.
Yeah. Especially in a democracy. Even that, monarchies could obviously go wrong. I'm not trying to paint them out to be some great things, but when everything is depending on one person, that can either go horribly wrong or it could actually go pretty well.
Right.
But when you have a democracy where every 4 years you have a new crop of psychopaths saying whatever they need to in order to try to get power, like it's going to go bad in a hurry, or it can go very bad in a hurry.
Or and not only that, when you have a government that since the 1960s had taken upon itself the responsibility to solve social problems with the arm of the federal government, that somehow these things that used to be the responsibility of state governments, local governments, families, and the church suddenly now becomes the responsibility of the federal government to handle with additional bureaucracy and federal agencies.
Yes.
Like, heck yeah, that's where that starts to go wrong real quick. It's like, well, we have to solve the social problem that the federal government really wasn't made to do. But, we just feel this intense guilt and shame.
Yes.
And so we have to fix it. We'll just turn on the money printer just a little bit to fix it. Because obviously, this is what the government is supposed to do. Right.
And so what you're describing is you're seeing a redefining of what it is to be a government. You're seeing as you're redefining money, you're redefining government, you're redefining again the role of government in education, you're redefining the role of government in all these ways. And so what always happens is what always happens, you have the Social Security Act. So all of a sudden now with the Social Security Act, you have now it's the government's role to provide for people's retirement. It's the government's role to provide for people monetarily. Now, what had been happening up to this point? Had everyone just been dying in the streets and it had been this horrible thing? No. You had, and even before this, you have like all throughout this period up through today, you have private charities, you have private hospitals, you have all these things that are providing for people's needs. But now around this time when the government starts to take control of the money supply, again, now they have the power to decide where to allocate that money. And so they can subsidize. They now have given themselves the ability to subsidize any ideas and messages that they want. And so it's no accident that all of trans and LGBT and all these kind of things that they start the reason they've been able to get to the place and the level of prominence that they have, despite being a minuscule percentage of the population, is because they've been subsidized for generations by money that's created and subsidies given by the federal government and by other federal governments around the world as well. It's not an accident. It's not just like a coincidence. There's a one-to-one relationship between that. They create the money without any work and then can send it out as their servants, their messengers, to go do their will effectively in the world. And so again, like money is this thing that allows governments to say, let my kingdom come and let my will be done. It's this satanic inversion in very real ways. It's an inversion of the Lord's Prayer, the prayer that that God calls humanity to live our lives according to, which is, may your kingdom come. And so this is one of my big arguments is that this question of fiat currency versus scarce money, or fiat money versus scarce money, like this is a huge issue because it represents a choice between living in the world that God made and living in a world that is made according to the image and likeness of politicians in men. Are we going to submit ourselves to the world that God made, which is scarce and has this all, predominant law, all governing, all expansive law of sowing and reaping? Or are we going to, with the serpent from Genesis 3, are we going to live just like that, where we can define reality according to our own desires and our own convenience? This is really what's at stake in this question. And it's really not it's not a difficult question to answer, but it's made purposely complex so that it's harder for the question is what would you do about this as Christians? How do you, if we recognize this is a horribly unjust system that, among other things, has enabled endless war for generations. It's enabled the systematic carving out of the education system, all these things. What do you really do about it at this point? And that's it's a fair question, but at some point you just have to stop digging the hole that you're seeing being dug in front of you. And so it's not just as simple as, and this, we could get into Bitcoin at this point, but it's not just as simple as, even though I think Bitcoin is one tool in this, it's one other alternative to this incredibly corrupt oppressive system that is doomed to fail, always has, and all these things. It's not just as simple as, oh, cool, we just moved to a new money and then that fixes everything. We have to go, like, we have to redefine and have these conversations about just these foundational level questions of what is money, what is government, what is it for, what are people, and what are people for? Like these baseline philosophical religious questions that we have just kind of shoved into a corner, or that have been shoved into a corner, as nationally for generations. We have to, like, those questions you can't escape from. They're going to affect you regardless of whether you ignore them or not. And you live out answers to those questions, whether you realize it or not. And we're coming to a point where everything is starting to crumble because we've neglected these first things for so long.
Well, yes. And I would say, like, do we have the choice to live in the world that God made or the world the government made? We actually don't have that choice.
Yes.
We only get to live in the world that God made. Yes. And sowing and reaping are dynamics. And I really hope that, there are a few people listening who have been unconvinced about Bitcoin, a few Christians listening that have been unconvinced about Bitcoin, that can feel their consciences tingling a little bit. The notion that something was sown. A lot of things have been sown. I think we just put a lot of pieces together. There was a book that came to mind, and I had to look it up. It's called The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell. Yeah. This book has come very highly recommended by many people that I trust. And that sort of indicates that, while, as you said, the canceling of the Bretton-Woods Agreement in 71, that came after all the spending malfeasance. That was done once America got called out, because the American government's attitude, or the people's attitude towards the use of government, was about solving social problems, developing all of these entitlements, which was not something that the federal government was designed for. But in order to make that possible, to solve all these social problems, there was this giant wave of guilt and shame that was washed over the boomers and the post-war generation, who bought it and said, well, we clearly have to take responsibility for ourselves, onto ourselves, to make this right, because God doesn't exist. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And let's fund the government to fix all of our problems. Yeah. Right. And voila, we're here. Right. And so I think that's the root of the moral case that gets made. Forget it. We'll get into Bitcoin in just a second, because I do want to land these two. But to look at the nature of the problem first and acknowledge independently that severing the money supply from anything tangible and scarce, like gold, for example, is what we have been using, and making it accessible, making money accessible to politicians and bureaucrats who can just switch it on, and then changing the entire ethic of government to solve problems it was never meant to do ad infinitum.
Yes.
It is, which then the behaviors that then subsidizes. And there's something, someone asked me a really provocative question years ago, and I haven't found a good answer for it. I think this might be the answer. I want to run it by you. Why is it that a Big Mac, this post-industrial product, a Big Mac made of beef patties and, allegedly it's a vegetable like lettuce, and this sauce and like these buns, and then the label and then the labor and all the stuff in the market, like this Big Mac is $1. It's made up of a bunch of different products that come from literally all over the world and assembled for $1. A Big Mac is $1, but an apple is $2. Why is that? And the best answer I can come up with, and the answer that someone gave me at the time, was because of government subsidies.
Yes.
That's the only thing that makes that possible.
100%.
So you're subsidizing social programs, and you're subsidizing corporations that are feeding us literal poison, while, single ingredient real foods is unaffordable. It's insanity. And this is why.
And then exactly 100%. There again, that the website you mentioned, WTF happened in 1971.com. Like they do work on that as well. But yeah, the effect of, and once the money, the position of the money creation changes, once that the source of the monetary creation changes, so change the incentives that go with it. Mm-hmm. And so when the United States is the one creating the money, when the government becomes the one, or the Federal Reserve becomes the one creating the money, then all of a sudden everyone is looking to them for favors. There's this group now that we can go to look for favors, because really, again, previously when you have scarce money, in order to get more of it, you have to go find it and do all this work. There's all this capital investiture. And so it's a lot more work involved than if now when fiat currency is operating, all you have to do is go become friends with the guy who has the power to create more money.
Yeah.
And then, if you become friends with him, you can convince him, and whether it's through promising kickbacks to him or whatever it would, whatever it happens to be. Again, yeah, it's so you create a different world than if you had scarce money. So again, yeah, all of these dynamics, it's not, yeah. There's this fantastic quote. The person I heard it from was Doug Wilson, but I'm sure it was somebody else. Is like, politics is downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from theology. Yep. And so, like, ultimately, at the end of the day, like what we're talking about, the redefinition of government, redefinition of people, of work, of all these things, those are theological moves that are happening. And so, like, you can't redefine those things. Like, you're taking the place of God when you start making, redefining those things. You're playing God. And so really what we have is, on a governmental and monetary level, there's been a lot of playing God that's been going on. And the problem is that people are really bad gods.
As it turns out, I am a terrible God.
Like, we don't have the omniscience and the omnipresence, and the omnipotent. We don't have the necessary resources to wield that type of power. And so that's why God, in his mercy and his love, did not give it to us. He wants us to allow him to be God. And then we find freedom in life in submitting ourselves and letting him handle those things. And then God wants us to be stewards, not gods. He wants us to steward the things that he's given to us and the processes that he's designed to govern the universe. And when we do those things, we find joy. We find freedom and happiness by submitting ourselves humbly before him.
Amen. And I would love to go running down that rabbit trail. But what I want to do is I want to rewind the clock. And now we're going to put you back in Uruguay as you're seeing all of these things for the first time. You're seeing financial malfeasance in Venezuela flooding into Uruguay. And you're like, what is going on here? Right. Yep. So let's start putting the case together for how some of these moral realizations that you made as a church planter in Latin America helped lead you towards Bitcoin as the conclusion, and now to where you are today with the Thank God for Bitcoin conference and book, etc.
Yep. Exactly. So yeah, what happened was I was sitting there and I'm thinking about this as it relates to the people who we're ministering to. And obviously, what is your responsibility? This is the question: is what do I do about this? What do I do about what I'm seeing in terms of, the effects of fiat currency and all these things? Like, is there really anything that can be done? So on an immediate level, we're just helping these people start their lives over. So we're helping them buy furniture, and we're helping them, we're doing like marriage counseling. We're doing different kinds of things. That's one level of very practical help that needs to happen. There's people living within worlds that are living in places where their worlds are being destroyed because of fiat currency. And part of the solution is, all right, you have to meet them right where they're at. So that's largely what we were doing while we were in Uruguay. That was one of the things that we were doing. But second, I was just trying to figure out, okay, is that it? Like, is that the only thing that we can do? And so that's where I kind of found Bitcoin. And so I got into Bitcoin in 2017. I had, bought like $100 worth of it. I just saw in the news that it had increased from $1,000 at the beginning of the year to, 10,000 near, I guess in December. And so again, I was just like, well, that's weird. I should get some. Okay. So I bought $100 worth, and then it promptly went from, 10,000 when I bought it up to 20,000 within a week or something. And so then I was just like, what is trying to figure out, like, what is happening right now? I didn't have any framework for understanding what it was. And so again, got into it, that happened. And then right after that, we had like a giant crisis happen with our team, our missionary team in Uruguay. And so the team leader and his family had to leave within like a month. And so basically overnight, I went from being the very content number 2, doing discipleship and leading music and, these kind of things, to being the head pastor overnight. And so basically anything that wasn't pastoring just completely like went out the window. And so completely forgot about Bitcoin, didn't even exist. And so just went to work, just pastoring and trying to, take up take up that mantle. So about a year and a half goes by, and Bitcoin was back in the news, and we were more stable. The church was more stable, and so I just said to myself, I was like, okay, this thing is back. It had gone down to 3,000 and then was back up at like 9,000. And so I just said to myself, okay, I have to understand this. I was a philosophy major. I always just kind of want to be able to at least have a base understanding of how things work. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go figure out how this thing works. And so over the course of like the next year, that was just kind of my little nerd out, try to, personal thing was just like, all right, what is this? Where does it come from? And what is it doing? Why is it so volatile? All these kind of things. And so the crazy thing in a nutshell that I found out was that the creation of Bitcoin, which happened in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, Bitcoin was created because of the fact that during the crisis, governments were able to create money out of thin air to basically, pay off their crony buddies. Basically, you help bail them out. Literally, you give them bailouts from losing billions of dollars, which as a consequence would have affected the American economy and all kinds of other things.
Too big to
basically
fail.
The fact, yes, exactly, too big to fail. So there were plenty of people who were plenty of people and families that had homes who were not too big to fail. They lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost all these things. But these big banks that had been the cause of this issue in the first place were bailed out with, money that the United States would then end up, basically through debt that was then passed along to the American people. So Bitcoin was created because of fiat currency, because we had a system where governments could create money out of thin air to devalue the purchasing power of everybody else in the name of saving the economy or saving certain actors within the economy. And so when I realized that, I just basically saw, wait a second, Bitcoin was created to try to make what is happening in Venezuela not possible. Like try to remove monetary creation from the hands of any one person or government. And so that if that is possible, that's a tremendously it's a tremendously valuable proposition, especially for the poorest people on earth. And so now again, there's caveats to that. Bitcoin is a digital currency, which, not everyone on earth has access to, but for the people who do have access to money, especially the more, the 4 billion people who have access to the internet, that kind of a development is a huge thing. It's a massive development for them, to give them a way to opt out of, the helpless participation that they have they have otherwise. So in the fiat system, it provides an alternative to the existing system that allows large scale wealth redistribution from the people, everyday people, to the government.
Got it. Yes. And I think the big benefit of it, which I've talked about in other podcasts. We haven't really touched on it here, but relative to the conversation we've been having, is that Bitcoin is anti-inflationary, meaning like gold. Gold is, you have to put in work. And thank you for helping me crystallize. Proof of work was something that I was, getting my arms around completely, and you've cinched it for me. But gold was something that you had to work to produce. The money printer requires no work to produce, but Bitcoin does require work to produce, not physical manual labor, but the work of an actual, but we'll say the work of a computer, energy, right, being fed into the process. And so you can't just, and this is why it is more sound money, it is more moral money than the money printer, because you can't just create it out of nothing. So what's being proposed, essentially the moral case between Bitcoin and fiat currency, is fiat currency can be printed out of nothing and applied towards things that those who print it can just unilaterally decide. We printed it. We have unilateral control over printing it. The supply is infinite. We're going to throw it at all these different problems that we think are problems, and you don't really get any say over it, right? Yeah. Versus Bitcoin, which works in the exact opposite way. No, this is hard bound to natural limits. It cannot simply be created out of nothing. It must be worked for. It is therefore scarce. And then we have to be more judicious about what we apply it to.
Yeah. Yes. That's very well said and very well put. I think, again, as Christians, especially, I'm guessing there's a lot of Reformed Christians who listen to your podcast. I'm sure that's not limited to that, but a lot of them are Reformed. And so within Reformed circles, you have like the idea of federal headship. Like you have like Jesus is our federal head.
Yep.
And so you have someone who their action, they have a representative action on behalf of a group of people. The horrifying reality that I came to was that the ways in which the United States dollar is being used, like, so again, the United States can print money and subsidize whatever they want to. What are some examples of that? We mentioned endless war earlier. Like, the United States is able to wage and basically subsidize any war that they want to because of the dollar. They can, because they have effectively unlimited amount of dollars, they can just go and do whatever they want to in terms of fighting wars. The other thing is they can force United States social policy on other countries around the world, or they can do their best to. And so the formula that takes, so again, why should Christians care about this? Because in your name, the United States government, because of fiat currency, is able to create $300 million out of thin air and send it to Africa to fund African abortions. Like, these are the type of things that are being done in your name. They're being done with quote unquote money that then also has the function of devaluing your purchasing power of the work that you're doing. And then it's also being used to wreak havoc and death on innocent people all over the world. And so, like, there's a huge cost beyond the monetary, or beyond the what's the word? Just beyond the monetary cost. There's a huge human cost to what's going on. And there's a huge human cost to, around the world, people who are made in God's image, who are having their lives torn apart because of the hubris of government officials and their insistence on maintaining the ability to create money, and refusing to submit themselves to a limiting factor, or a money that serves as a limiting faction on their hubris and their desire to do whatever they want. And so this is a huge issue that Christians should care a lot about. And this is, I think about, it's Psalm 2. Again, what is Psalm 2? Basically, it talks about the nations of the earth. I'm going to read it here. It says, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords from us. And so the nations of the earth, all these wicked kings who don't want to bow their knee to King Jesus, are saying, let's get rid of any restraint that God is putting on us. Like, we want to be our own gods. We want to operate completely autonomously in the world. And what I'm suggesting to every Christian out there is that fiat currency represents one of the most influential ways, consequential ways, that governments do this exact thing. They basically throw off scarcity in order to be able to do whatever they want to do in the world. And so Christians, regardless of whether you like Bitcoin or not, like regardless of whether you care about Bitcoin or you think Bitcoin, you understand it or think it's valuable, whatever, this is still an issue that you have to reconcile with in any event. And so the question is, and there, again, how are you going to do that? There's lots of people who, including lots of Christians who look at things like gold and silver. They say, hey, this is real money. And this is, I'm still going to continue to invest in this because, again, this can't last forever. And I agree with all those things. I think, again, I'm advocate of gold and silver. I think that, they still have a place. They still have a value. But you can't, the one thing you can't do is just continue to operate and just, this isn't a big deal. Just the money that we have being backed by nothing. You can't, as a Christian, just say, I don't care about that. Like, you don't have, there's moral consequences to that kind of thing that have had consequences for a very long time, and that are having increasingly pervasive, increasingly perverse consequences as time goes on.
A lot of people are asking right now, how do we get here? What's going on? And a lot of people are waking up to a lot of different things. One of them is that Christless conservatism has conserved nothing, right? That's a big disillusioning factor. Like, we're all aware that Democrats are all fallen and sinners and have rejected God. And one of the hard realizations is that, conservatives who don't profess Christ and mean it, they haven't done a great job either, because they don't have any tools to do it. I think the calendar gate revealed a lot of that. And Christians are becoming very convicted about that. But what you begin to see when you look closely at this, is like, well, a big way that we got here is that we were able to pay for it. Like all of these social programs, all of these wars, all of these things that have characterized 2020, COVID, for example, in 2020, yep. Right? 100%. All of these things that characterize our world, they had to be paid for. Where did the money come from? It came from the money printer. And that is just whatever you think the solution is, that's a different question. Like you have to look at this world that we live in was bought and paid for out of nothing, out of absolute fiat currency. Let there be money, yep. Right? And 100%. Right, instead of let there be light, let there be darkness via money.
Exactly. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Let there be might is really what it, like they're saying, like let us exercise our power, and we're going to control and govern and fashion again the world that looks the way that we want it to.
Yep. Okay. So I don't know that we can make the moral case any clearer, right? For the flaws of fiat currency. Now, if someone wants to go in and actually look at how money is created, right? Literally, like the actual mechanics of it, the wicked mechanics of it. Because what we've been saying is that fiat currency, let there be might, which is awesome. Fiat currency enables all of these profound worldwide social ills, right? And fiat currency itself came out of like injustice with malfeasance after World War II and then getting called out on it. So like it's corrupt from beginning to end. And then you can look in the founding of the Federal Reserve, and we won't even go there. We will not go there because we'll be here all day.
Another 3 hours, but
another 3 hours. Let's go. So, okay. So, and independent of the effects of it and its history and where it came from, where fiat currency came from, and the historical warnings about it. If you want to look into the mechanics of it, you can do that. You can do that on your own, because that'd be a whole separate conversation. But what I want to do is bring it back to the question that we started with. Like we've just shown that fiat currency is, if not inherently evil in itself, it is certainly a very powerful tool that evil uses very skillfully.
Correct.
Right. Mm-hmm. So in the face of that, and I think we've landed that argument, in the face of that, why should we be thanking God for Bitcoin?
Yeah. So Bitcoin, again, as we mentioned, you mentioned the term proof of work. That just basically means like it's got sowing and reaping built into it. So Bitcoin is a scarce currency. Again, there's going to be lots of questions about this, because again, the one thing that Bitcoin is not, it's great, but Bitcoin is not super simple.
Right.
So Bitcoin it's a scarce money. There's a fixed supply of Bitcoin that will ever exist, and that number is 21 million. There will only ever be 21 million. There's people who ask us as well, if this is a digital money, what's preventing someone from creating more? It's a big, long, complicated answer, but suffice to say, they can't create more. Like the cat's out of the bag. Due to how Bitcoin works, it's just not going to happen. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. It's a scarce money. Another thing is that it's a decentralized money. So there's no one person who has control over Bitcoin being issued. If we're going to use the illustration of the gold miner, the prospector, anyone right now can run out into their field. Let's say this: back when gold was money, anybody could run out into the field, get a pickaxe, dig up in the ground, and if they find gold, the money belongs to them. They have not out of nowhere, but just previously they did not have money, and then they found this money that existed, and they can use it. Bitcoin functions very similarly. Rather than it being physical ground for you to dig into, Bitcoin is like a software program basically that you can participate in and run. And by participating in it and through a process that's either called mining or hashing, you can basically try to find new Bitcoin. You trade computational power and electricity for the opportunity to try to access new, quote unquote, virgin Bitcoin that's coming into existence, or that's being found. It's really not coming into existence; it's being found. So that's very similar to how gold operates, and very different than something like the Federal Reserve and how fiat currency is created. There are central points of money creation. that are centralized. So you have things like central banks. They're actually doing the physical work of creating money. The Treasury actually does that. The Treasury actually creates the physical currency, but the vast majority of money that's created today is created digitally. You have digital creation of money through the issuance of new debt. So when you go to buy a house, okay, but let's say there's a $1 million house that's over there. For most people, the way that they buy that house is not by paying cash for that house. The money that they're using to buy is not the product of, I went out and worked hard for 30 years, I saved up $1 million, and then I plopped that $1 million down on the table to buy this house. In the vast majority of cases, the way that the houses are paid for is through the issuance of a mortgage. And then that money gets paid to whoever is the creation of a new debt for $1 million that gets, created into the world. And then you have to pay back that debt over the course of time. So rather than being a debt-based money that is issued through a centralized, issuer who has godlike control over its issuance, you have the Bitcoin system where there are 21 million Bitcoin that are out there, and you can be one of the people who are out there investing time and money and other resources in order to be able to try to quote unquote dig it up or access it. So it's scarce that way. There's no one central point of issuance. Anyone who wants to can go buy a Bitcoin mining computer and start to mine Bitcoin that way. You don't have to depend on some government or whatever it is. Again, there's a bunch of these other things. Another thing is that I can. Unlike silver and gold, people think about gold and silver as in their tangibility being a benefit, which in some ways it is. Like, it's something you can hold in your hand, and it's something you can hold in your hand, you can take it with you. It's physical, and people are like, yes, that's a value proposition. That's also a downside. It's also got its limitations, and the best example of this that I have is, so our Venezuelan friends, when they had to flee Venezuela, they wouldn't have been able to bring gold with them. Like they couldn't bring it on a plane or something like that. It'd be too heavy, because of how expensive gold is. Like, they would quickly, it just would be it'd be a nightmare to use in a situation like that.
Right.
Even more germane to this point is most of them walked across the Venezuelan border. So imagine you've got a backpack and you've got a couple of gold bars in your backpack. Number one, that's heavy. It's inconvenient. Also, the people leaving the border, because all these people knew that these Venezuelans were walking across the border, leaving to try to establish life somewhere else. They were walking targets. And so if you're taking your life savings, you're storing your life savings in gold or silver, you're walking across this thing and you get robbed, you're out to lunch. There's nothing that, you're an easy target for losing everything. The crazy thing with Bitcoin is Bitcoin, basically you can access it using like a 12-word passphrase. So, or like effectively a password. So you can, in that case, you can memorize a 12-word passphrase in your head. You can write it down in a book or something like that, tattoo it on your body, whatever you want to do. You can do that, cross any border in the world. Nobody even knows that you have anything of value. It looks like you have nothing. And then you get to where you're going, you plug in those 12 words, and then you have, boom, access to your money again. So the ability to do that is it's a huge game-changing innovation for the millions of people who are displaced, for any one of number of political things going on in their country. Imagine your country is in a horrible situation. You can leave and start over with real money. There's all kinds of ways in which Bitcoin is advantageous. I'll give one last one. This is the one that I got to interview Doug Wilson, and
oh wow, congratulations!
Thanks. Yeah. So I
about Bitcoin.
So for the last 15 minutes, I talked to him about money for the first 45 minutes, and then the last 15, I went specifically about Bitcoin.
But one of the things I said to him.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah. So, but one of the things I said to him was, Pastor Wilson, I've been thinking about you as relates to Bitcoin for a long time. I know through following them on social media, I know that you guys have been saving. You didn't want to go into debt. You guys have been saving to build a building for years. And so I said to him, you're not exactly a wilting, what's the idiom? Like a wilting daisy or something. You don't shy away from saying what you think and what the scriptures teach. So like we are in a world now where you could preach a sermon about transgenderism or LGBT or whatever you want to be. You could preach a sermon and then be debanked for that, for expressing those opinions publicly. Like that's not far from happening. We already had the Canadian trucker protest where for expressing the wrong political opinions, people lost access to their bank accounts overnight. And so Bitcoin enables, in that type of world, Bitcoin enables you to have access to your money that isn't mediated by, again, a banking institution or something along those lines. You can self-custody your Bitcoin in anything from an app on your phone or actual things that are called hardware wallets that just basically aren't, you can store them offline in such a way that there's no mediating presence giving you access, who you can either decide to give you access or to deny you access to your money. So in that world, Christians, that's a very valuable thing for Christians here in the United States, but then also in context of, as I mentioned earlier, my experience as a missionary, that's an incredibly valuable tool for missionaries. There are countries such as North Korea and all these different things that have been shut off from access to U.S. banking rails, like the SWIFT system. They've been closed off from access to it, which again, we can debate about how helpful that is on one level. But what that also means is that it's much more difficult for gospel workers to get resources into those places as well. And so from a Christian standpoint, Bitcoin is being used around the world today to send money into impossible or very difficult to reach places that's very difficult to move resources into any other way. So those are a number of the ways in which I think are compelling reasons for Christians to not just actively just think Bitcoin is the dumbest thing ever. There's very real concerns that Bitcoin helps alleviate.
So in addition to the individual case of how the individual is able to protect their accrued wealth from being debanked, right? From being financially censored, from the looming threat of potentially central bank digital currencies, which is a whole other conversation.
Whole other thing. Yep.
Yeah. And the ability to do missionary work with refugees and the ability and the portability of it, versus gold bars, et cetera, and the de-inflationary ability of it. What the picture that we painted was of the great evil that the United States government has been perpetrating using fiat currency for endless wars and unjust social programs and subsidies and all that stuff. Okay. So maybe we can just spend, the last few minutes talking about how can Christians collectively leverage Bitcoin to push back on the evil behavior of the American government using fiat currency? So we can use Bitcoin as a tool for our own lives and for missionary work out there in the world, et cetera. How can we leverage it back against the wickedness that we're seeing being perpetrated with fiat currency by our own government? How does this fit into that picture?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think of Bitcoin primarily as a defensive thing. This is actually a big debate within the Bitcoin world. Like, there's people who there's a guy who's in the U.S. military who named Jason Lowry, who wrote a book called I can't even remember what it's called, but it's basically he lays out Bitcoin as a weapon. Oh, that's horrible. I can't remember what it's called, but basically lays out, he's talking about Bitcoin as if it's a weapon. And his argument is that the United States needs to treat this as a weapon. And basically, I think you're looking it up. Yeah, please do. Yeah. Let me know when you find it. But
is Bitcoin warfare?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. Something about
Bitcoin as
that might be an article.
Bitcoin as weapon systems. Yeah.
Yes. So that guy, he is a Bitcoiner, and what he's arguing is that the United States needs to treat Bitcoin as a strategic weapon and asset. He's not saying he wants the United States to start adopting Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. His thing is basically there's other nations. This is a thing that Softwar. That's it exactly. Yeah. So he's saying that this is a resource that has global geopolitical implications, and the United States should adopt it as soon as humanly possible. So now that's one way to frame it. This is this weapon. Okay, exactly. Now then there's a whole nother segment of people, and I tend to be more again, there's truth in what Lowry's saying, but like I tend to be more partial to this, is like thinking of Bitcoin as a defensive. It's a more of a defensive weapon. It's like a shield to protect you. It's to protect wealth, to protect, just your savings. We're not out there trying to take over the world and fight against these things actively. What Bitcoiners are saying is that this system of fiat currency, everywhere it's been tried, it fails. And so if it's doomed to fail, we should move away from it. And if it's doomed to fail, if it's going to be doomed to fail at the very end, and in the meantime, it's subsidizing all these awful things, well, then we should move away from it. So, I think this is, so what should Christians do? I think that Christians, one of the simple ways is educating themselves on what money is, how it works, and then on some of the things that are being done in their name and have been done in their name around the world. Part of it's just educational, just understanding what this is and seeing how this relates to things that the priorities and things that God has told us we should care about, because there is a ton more overlap than the average people, the average person is aware of. I'll plug a couple of books that have any relation to me. One of them is, what's it called? Honest Money by Gary North. It's a very short little introduction for a little more of a scholarly treatise. It's not impossible, unapproachable at all, but it's a little bit higher level. There's a book called The Ethics of Money Production by an Austrian economist named Jörg Guido Hulsmann. I'd highly recommend him. This book, Hulsmann, I believe it's Hullsmann. It's the double N. But basically, he unpacks the work of this 15th century Catholic bishop named Nicholas Oresme, and just basically points out how this guy he really saw the reality of the issues of the ethics of money production. So he just basically called out, I can't remember the prince's name. There was a prince who was over time adding baser metals into the money, the coin supply. So he, rather than having 99% gold, he would, put like 2%, 1 year he'd put 2% of bronze or whatever into the thing. So then the next year he'd put 3%. And so over time, that was a way, and this is what Oresme called out. He said, basically, you're stealing from the people by convincing them to use something, you're saying that it's 100% or 99%. In reality, it's less than that. And with that spread, you're enlarging your own ability, your political power is basically what you're doing. Is some earlier version of what's happening in Venezuela. So that book is fantastic. I'd highly recommend to try to get a grasp around these issues and why they matter. Those two books, depending on who you are good resources on that front. But so again, education is part of this. Just understanding, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Obviously, the context of that, when Jesus is saying that is about salvation. But this is also true of truth more broadly. Truth, when we see the truth, it helps us to live more skillfully and more accurately according to the way that God designed the world to live. So education is a big part of it. Another part is just buying Bitcoin and just like learning, like interacting with it. It needs to be $5 worth of Bitcoin, just like buying it and interacting with it, just so you see how it is. It can be intimidating, as I mentioned, to kind of describe and talk about and explain all the different facets of it. But you don't need to understand all those things in order to use it, any more than you need to understand how a computer works in order to benefit from it. Everyone uses computers, and the vast majority of us don't know at all how they work. So that would be the other thing I would say was just look at just start buying some of it. And then just using it or whatever, interacting with it. That would be my recommendation. Another thing would just be looking more intentionally at, again, the systems that are in our lives. So you have things like, educational system. Again, we mentioned this earlier. The reason why the educational system in the United States, the public education system, can produce and subsidize, or can foster all this insanity is because they are the one funding it. And so just taking stock of the fact that your money has power, and your money is subsidizing messages and entities, whether you want to or not. That's just the reality. And so asking yourself the question, am I subsidizing what I actually believe? Or am I giving life to things that deserve to die and that never should have existed in the first place? I think that's another thing, like an action step that I would mention. I think that I'm sure there's others, but those are three that off the top of my head that I think would be helpful.
Yeah, as I was listening to you talk your way through all those things, I'm just thinking back to all the people that I've interviewed about Bitcoin. Jimmy Song, fiat ruins everything. Like, we maybe touched on Bitcoin as a subject at the very end of that interview, if at all, because his book is all about the ways that fiat currency specifically does ruin everything. Like, it's a
Yep.
great book to read for that.
It is.
And probably my best podcast of all time was Laser
Awesome.
Huddle, which was like,
Oh, yeah.
like that, the 5 hour, the longest podcast ever, like my favorite one. Love that guy.
Yep.
So, that was a couple years ago, I think it was. And, that lays out what we call the geopolitical case, right?
Yep.
For Bitcoin. I think about the Bitcoin Coach, which is like how to get started with it. Andrew Howard, like all these different conversations. And I'm very grateful for this one because it's really laid out in very stark and clear terms the moral and even theological case, behind why Christians specifically should be thinking about this. Like this is why I'm interested in this topic. This isn't just like some hobby. Like, I like building model airplanes, so I'm going to force all my listeners to listen to me interview guys who are into model airplanes. Exactly. Indulge me as I talk about. No, like, this matters, right? Okay. So you and I met at your conference, and that it's the Thank God for Bitcoin project is a larger project. I want to give you a chance to talk about everything that you're doing there with your podcast and the books and the things that you have. So spend some time, please, talking about the magnitude and the scope of the things that you do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. We met at the conference. We do at least, basically, we do a couple events every year. The biggest one, we do one big event, which the last 2 years has been in Miami. It's just the TGFB conference. So we did TGFB 22, TGFB 23, and then this year will be TGFB 24. This will be our third year. And so what we do, basically, this past year we talked about Bitcoin for 2 days. We did a 2-day event, did it as cheaply as we could pricing wise, and then just spent 2 days. Day one was just introducing what is Bitcoin. It was basically designed to be a place where if you know nothing about Bitcoin, you can come and get like a quick little crash course on what it is, how it works, some on the ethics of money production, some of the stuff we've talked about. And then in day two, we did more of like applying those things. So what are ways and places in which Bitcoin is being used around the world in ways that maybe are not intuitive? And so we have, again, people from all walks of life, people who are, we had, I think, 3 or 4 pastors who were there who spoke, who are Bitcoiners. And again, the emphasis is not, like, only a part of the emphasis is Bitcoin as investment. What we're talking about, that absolutely, that absolutely is part of this, because money is part of our life and investing is part of our life. But a big part of this is just understanding some of what we talked about, just the dynamics and ways that money affects people differently all over the world. Just we could spend literally another 8 hours unpacking all these different ways in which, for good or for ill, people are being helped or affected by money. So we wanted to, foster and facilitate a place for that conversation to happen, just to start that conversation. Beyond that, we have the Thank God for Bitcoin podcast. At this point, that's primarily conversations like this one. It's primarily conversations where, we're just talking to people who are Bitcoiners about why they care about Bitcoiners. There's people who are programmers who work within the industry. There's other people who are, again, pastors who talk about different aspects of it. We talk to, again, just all kinds of different walks of life who are Christians and Bitcoiners, or whose stories will benefit Christians and or Bitcoiners. So, for instance, we had BJ Dichter, who is the mouthpiece or the representative for the Canadian trucker protest. He was like the spokesperson for them. That's the word I was looking for, spokesperson. And so he came out. He's not a Christian, but has a wild story. And so basically, again, the thing I mentioned with Doug Wilson, this has been something that I'd been thinking about for a long time. And then this was like a perfect use case for Bitcoin. And he just talks about how Bitcoin enabled them to continue to do the protests when they got cut off from their bank accounts. There were people who donated Bitcoin to them, and it was the one money that they weren't able to, or that they were able to access, the government couldn't shut them off from. So we foster those kind of conversations. We also, I'm also the co-host of another podcast called Thank God for Noster, where Bitcoin is decentralized money. Noster is a decentralized information protocol. And so the idea is that it's an information protocol that you can't get canceled from. So whereas Twitter, they can cancel my Twitter account and all of a sudden I can't access it anymore. it's a communication network that you can't be cut off from. So I host that podcast with another Christian guy who's a developer in the Nostr space. And so we have those that, again, fostering very similar conversations. There's some overlap, but there's enough not overlap that that justify the other podcast. I have another podcast that's kind of on the back burner that's called The Economics of Glory, where we just go through biblical passages, looking at them through an economic lens. The scriptures talk a ton about money. Jesus talks a ton about money, and there's just a lot for Christians to learn and see that maybe that we're just not used to seeing when we think about the scripture. So I've only got a couple, I think 1 or 2 episodes up for that one. And it's going to be, again, more of a personal project at this point. This coming year, the conference, I'll just give a little quick summary of that. This year, what we're going to do is we want to do a 1-day, it's going to be a 2-day event, July 24th and 25th in Nashville. We'd love to have you guys there. And basically what we're going to do this year is day 1 is just going to be an introduction to a robust Christian vision of economics. We're not even going to talk about Bitcoin on day 1. Like, we're going to get into what does the scripture say about money? We're going to have different kinds of speakers from all over the country who are, experts in their field. We already have confirmed C.R. Wiley is going to be joining us again. He's going to be speaking about household economics. We're also going to have Dr. Ben Merkel is going to be there. Talking about the role that money plays in education, and why they at New St. Andrews College have made the decisions that they've made about the sources of funding that they will and will not accept. So we're looking forward to that. And then we're going to have, again, we're still looking there's a number of people who we've reached out to, and we're just still working on getting them there that are more well known within the Christian finance world. So again, the one that it doesn't seem to be possible, but the big whale would be Dave Ramsey, because he's been a pretty vocal opponent of Bitcoin, but he's also based in Nashville. So we're working on that. If there's anyone out there who wants to pray on our behalf, that we could make that happen, that'd be fun. But yeah, so day 1 is just intro to economics from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective, and then day 2 is, again, very similar, just intro to what Bitcoin is and how it works. And so that's what we're doing. You can find out more information at tgfb.com about all of those things. And then if you want to buy tickets for the event, you can find those at tgfb.com/store. So yeah, that's who we are, what we're doing podcasts and events. And then again, looking to do some more consulting for different Christian organizations who are ready to at least ask questions, if not take the step of buying Bitcoin and all those kind of stuff. We offer consulting services there too. So
that's fantastic. Do you want to talk for a minute about your book?
Sure. Yeah, actually, yeah. I
really loved your book, by the way.
Awesome. No, I'm happy to hear that. And again, that was an incredible, I never imagined, I had thought that maybe someday I would write a book about something, whether our experiences in Uruguay or something along those lines. Never thought I would write a book about money. And so ended up writing this book about Bitcoin, that just basically, again, is just designed to be a summation of the kind of the conversation that we've had. And then we get into Bitcoin in the last 2 chapters. It's written at a 9th grade reading level. It's designed to be just your average person who's never thought about money production before, just kind of an introduction to the topic. So that's what Thank God for Bitcoin is. You can find that on Amazon or anywhere else books are sold. I think the craziest thing for me, I'll share this story. I don't know how many Roman Catholic listeners you have, but hopefully they'll forgive me. But one of the craziest thing that happened related to the book was that the book, I always joke that we got to experience every Protestant's dream, which was Thank God for Bitcoin came out the same week as the book by the Pope, and we were outselling the Pope. We were like, take that, Bang. Bishop of Rome,
Very satisfying.
Exactly. So that's the first book. And then I have 3 other books in the works. We have a kid's book that's going to be called The Orange Umbrella. It's basically a Bitcoin intro that never mentions Bitcoin. Again, talks about a lot of these things in a more humorous and fun way. We have another book called The Gospel According to Bitcoin that just basically, whereas Thank God for Bitcoin was designed to introduce Bitcoin to Christians, The Gospel According to Bitcoin is designed to introduce Jesus to Bitcoiners. And so that book is hopefully going to come out within the next 2 or 3 months here. And then the one that's kind of like it's going to take a while longer, it's going to be called, the working title is money through new eyes, the economics of glory is basically what it is. It's just unpacking money itself through a biblical lens. And there's just all kinds of surprising, just things that have just kind of blown my mind over the last 5 years that I've been, thinking about money and working through these lenses. So those things are all in various different stages of production, and hopefully those will be out and helpful to people as soon as possible.
You are into a lot of things, sir.
And that's why it's like, get a bunch of things burning, but I'm also a dad of young kids. And so all of these things, they just have to work on them in ways and according to time schedules that work for everybody. So again, this is why some of them are going to take longer than others, but
I will say just real quick, just to bring it all back, like when I was on the way to the conference, not knowing anything about it, but just knowing that I wanted to go check out what, C.R. Wiley had to say about it. Cause I'd just been at the Trad Dad conference. I read Thank God for Bitcoin on the plane. And it was one of those books that I was already into Bitcoin at the time, but it was one of those books that permanently shifted the way that I saw things and really opened my eyes to where the root of social problems today come from, which is the unjust money supply. Like I saw in a totally new way. So it was a really transformative experience reading that book. So thank you for that.
I'm glad to hear that. Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. Again, it's like it's one of these books where, again, like there's so much more that could have been said and that could have been put in there, and especially on like a biblical, an exhaustive biblical level, and
right.
Because there's so much more, like we said, that's what the thrust of this, the Economics of Glory book is going to be. But again, for what it is and for the purpose that it was written and for the response that we've received to it, it's kind of blown our minds. I mean, we've sold a bunch of books, and again, it served to be that introduction to this topic that we were hoping that it would be. So
praise God, man. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and all the people that are helping you and helping to bring this message to Christians who I hope are getting ready to hear it. And I think that will be an increasing theme in the months and years to come, God willing.
Yep. Hope so. Yep.
Cool, man. Well, I'm guessing you want to send everyone to tgfb.com.
Yep. Yeah. tgfb.com. Again, tgfb.com/store if you're interested in coming to the conference. And then you can find me on Twitter, or I refuse to call it X. So Twitter, I refuse. I'm like, it's just so dumb. But yeah, so on Twitter, my handle is @JMBushWrites, WRITES. And I'm sure we can put that in the show notes or something. But yeah, and then if you want to talk, again, I'm happy for you to chat and reach out. If you reach out there, I'm happy to chat and help out in any way that I can.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jordan. I really appreciate this whole conversation and all the work that you do.
Cool. Thank you, man. I know all the work that goes into producing podcasts and the time it takes to prepare and all that kind of stuff. So thank you.